Our next speaker, Michael Yonan, is Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Missouri. He's the author of Empress Maria Theresa and the Politics of Habsburg Imperial Art that was published by Penn State Press in 2011, and of Cultural Aesthetics of 18th-Century Porcelain, co-edited with Alden Kavanaugh, that appeared in 2010, as well as numerous articles on the arts in 18th century Central and Northern Europe. Michael's book, Messerschmitt's Character Heads, Maddening Sculpture, and the Writing of Art History, will be published by Routledge this coming summer. Michael is also the editor of a new book series called The Material Culture of Art and Design, that is for Bloomsbury Academic, and he's also the series editor for Ashgate, now Routledge's Histories of Material Culture and Collecting, 1700 to 1950, which I'm pleased to say included one of the Center's publications several years ago on British models of collecting and the American response. This afternoon, Michael will present his thoughts about porcelainist sculpture, meaning, materiality, and the categories of 18th century collecting. Please give a warm welcome to Michael.
Thank you, everybody. Okay. The story of porcelain's beginnings in China, the institutionalization of its production under imperial authority at Jingdezhen, the role it played in several major early modern global economies, its rise to the ne plus ultra of ceramics in 18th century Europe, and the complicated history it has had since, all of this regularly attracts the attention of both scholars and the popular viewer. To summarize its significance, it may be enough to note, following the historian Robert Finley, that porcelain was the first truly global product, a medium for objects produced not only for specific sites and uses, but for international exchange. The European discovery of porcelain at Meissen, quote, discovery of porcelain at Meissen, and the subsequent development of European manufactories, as well as the commercialization of porcelain production at heritage houses like Meissen and Sèvres, are likewise standard components of our history of 18th century collecting. And furthermore, as the scholarship of Maureen Cassidy Geiger has demonstrated, porcelain was of central importance to international diplomacy in the form of diplomatic gifts. We may then surmise from its historical and critical importance that porcelain's role in the histories of 18th century collecting is securely understood and its place in the classificatory systems that structured the arts confirmed. Yet I would hesitate to say that. Well studied though it is, porcelain's significance to 18th century collecting practices is surprisingly complex. To locate porcelain within a putative history of ceramics, and therefore of the decorative arts, gives the interpreter one view of its importance. To understand it as part of a broader history of art gives a different one. The problem arises out of modern art historical classifications, which tend to locate influence within specific media rather than across them. And this results in turn from academic specializations that encourage scholars to look carefully at one kind of art and sometimes less closely at others. There was a parallel problem in the 18th century in that what defined the boundaries of art, quote, art, was in a state of transformation, one for which porcelain found itself right in the middle. Porcelain objects' status as art, or better said, what kind of art porcelain was subject to great variation of explanation depending on context, the type of object in question, and its heritage. At the root of the problem is the ontological status of the art object itself, a big subject indeed, but luckily our focus this afternoon is on collections of sculpture, which helps me narrow it. In a sense, there is no good reason not to describe a room like the porcelain cabinet at Schloss Charlottenburg in Berlin as a sculptural collection. It brings together three-dimensional objects and arranges them in a carefully conceived display, the purpose of which is to draw attention to the objects themselves and their aesthetic qualities, characteristics that would be largely at home in many other kinds of sculptural collections. Yet few of us would call this a sculptural collection. our hesitation has 18th century origins, and my goal today will be to map out this situation to show how porcelain almost became a high art, namely sculpture, at an early moment in its European production. 18th century collections moved closer to transforming porcelain into sculpture than at any time since, but we shall see that in porcelain's seductive materiality lay both its potential to reach that goal and its limitation. Let us begin by talking a little bit about materiality. Materiality is not, as so much art historical writing assumes, synonymous with medium. One component of a work of art's materiality is, in fact, its medium. It matters enormously whether a painting is made of oil, tempera, or acrylics, and the possibilities that each medium allows, as well as the limits that it proscribes, are an essential component of that work of art, and ideally should play a role in the scholarly interpretation of it. But once a work of art is made, its medium becomes incorporated into the broader materiality of its culture, which is better described as how medium creates the status of the artwork as a thing that interacts with other things to form a specific material world. This material world is forever in flux, changing over time, and within a material world, different materialities interrelate, carry meanings, clash with each other, or otherwise inflect how individuals understand how the world functions. Imagining how an object fits within the philosophical, ethical, perceptual, and economic structures of a given moment is one way to understand its materiality, which produces a much broader and, to my mind, more exciting way of talking about an object. Probably in your mind at this moment is the question of how we designate something as a thing. This is a major philosophical question that I will not attempt to solve in a simple paper. But let me say with great circularity that we know a thing is a thing because we encounter its materiality. Its special, seductively shiny materiality was, of course, one component of what made porcelain so desirable among 18th century collectors. It is also, paradoxically, what made porcelain difficult to understand as sculpture, even when porcelain was used for figural modeling that directly mimicked the dynamics of viewing small-scale sculptures. We shall come to that in a moment, but nowhere do we encounter this confusion about porcelain's materiality more than in the earliest court attempts to collect and display it. We can see this clearly in the most famous sculptural display of the early 18th century, or porcelain sculptural display, albeit one that did not survive for long, and we know it today through preparatory drawings, which I will show you, namely the porcelain collections put on display at the Japanisches Palais in Dresden under the supervision of the Polish-Saxon elector King Augustus the Strong, whose place in the history of European porcelain is, of course, very secure. Augustus was so fascinated by Asiatic porcelains that he pushed local philosopher artisans, Walter Ehrenfried von Tschirnhaus and Johann Friedrich Böttger, to create porcelain in Dresden, leading to the development eventually of the Meissen manufactory. And of course, Augustus amassed staggering amounts of porcelain, both Asiatic and European in origin, numbering into the tens of thousands of individual objects. Just as a slight aside, there may be a direct connection between this famous collection of porcelain in Dresden and the Prussian one that I showed you a moment ago. Scholars have proposed that Augustus only became interested in creating such an enormous display for his porcelain collection after visiting Berlin in 1709, to which he traveled to form an alliance with Prussia and Denmark against Sweden. During that trip, he certainly visited Charlottenburg and may have had this room in mind when overseeing the designs for the displays at the Japanisches Palais. The building was not a palace in the usual sense. It was not a courtly residence, but instead a gigantic show space to be used in receptions, ceremonies, and diplomatic visits. The building's history has been well studied. I would mention recent scholarship by Cordula Bischoff, Ulrich Pietsch, and Samuel Witwer for the knowledge they have imparted to our understanding of its genesis and function. Today I shall emphasize two aspects of its interior arrangement and design. The first concerns the way in which the display of the royal porcelain collection was conceived. The second is the range of objects on view and how they might be classified as sculpture, decorative arts, or something else. Although the documentary record for the Japanisches Palais is rich, our understanding of exactly how porcelains were displayed in its interior is imperfect, as they were dismantled around 1770. We know something of its possible arrangement from a series of drawings for the interior produced by a group of Saxon court architects, each of which grappled with issues of how to present the Elector's porcelain collection in a most appealing manner. The first drawings come from the studio of Matthäus Daniel Perpelmann, well known as the architect of the Zwinger Palace, but also put into service to outfit the Japanisches Palais. In one of several drawings for the project, in this case showing a display of porcelain object in the palace's upper story and dating from around 1730, we find something remarkably close to the example from Charlottenburg. Ornate shelves and pedestals are arranged across the surface of the wall. Resting upon them are porcelain vases, tureens, and some small animal figurines. Also sketched into the design are Asiatic pagods, these smiling Buddha-like figures, smirking masks, candle sconces, and tendrils of purely ornamental filigree. These function to incorporate the objects displayed into a rich and fantastic Asiatic theme. In this respect, Perpelmann modifies the well-known wall display templates provided by Daniel Marot in his highly influential Nouvelle Cheminée of 1712, which were extremely influential in guiding the display of porcelain and other precious objects in noble interiors, and particularly so in Germany. Perpelmann's display positions the porcelain objects in it as components of the interior architecture, as largely fixed entities within its design. In a sense, then, porcelain here asserts its presence through its purely formal qualities, alongside whatever wisps of narrative might be implied through the figural elements. The point is to see porcelain as part of a whole. Whether we can call this a display of sculpture, however, is not so clear, although one might note that it operates here more like architectural sculpture in that it adorns a space as part of a decorative program. Insofar as architectural sculpture might be conceived as a sculptural collection, so too might that designation apply for this room. And insofar as the porcelain objects are primarily meant here to be seen, and seen within a decorative patterning, they might come closer to sculpture than they otherwise would. The sharp-eyed among you might have noticed that Perpelmann's design is somewhat old-fashioned for 1730, in case you're into that. And apparently that is also how it looked to Augustus the Strong, since the Elector King brought in a second architect to offer an alternative conception of the palace's displays. This was the French-born Zacharias Longlune, active in Dresden, who produced a series of drawings for the palace's interior around 1735. Not only do these designs arrange the porcelain objects in the palace entirely differently, updating them in a way understood as the French manner, they imply a different conception of the porcelain object as a material entity. Here is one of Longlune's drawings for a room on the palace's ground floor. Of course, we should remember that, as with many 18th century architectural drawings, this one represents several options for potential building. It is not a view of any actual segment of wall. I show it here to provide insight into the concept behind porcelain's display as Longlune understood it. In it, we find once again porcelain arranged in patterns on the wall's surface and also on pedestals, as in Perpelmann's drawings, but something important has changed. The balance between wall ornament and porcelain object has been rethought, with the porcelains given greater presence and emphasis. Indeed, they become the primary decoration of the wall, not simply one component among many decorative elements. The result is that individual objects are easier to apprehend as discrete pieces. The result is also to let each object speak, if one can say that, more directly for itself. We also know from a memorandum written by Longlune around this time that there were practical considerations behind this structure of display. In it, he remarks that the advantage of displaying porcelains like this is that it enabled the objects to be moved around, removed from their place on the wall and held, and more broadly to allow new objects to be switched in for others according to the patron's wishes. The flexibility of display also reveals Longlune's understanding of Augustus's collecting practices, since it indicates that the collection as a whole could be improved as new and presumably better quality porcelain pieces were acquired. The porcelain as individual objects are not fixed constituent parts of the room, but rather are individual pieces with their own independence. They operate more like a collection and less like the architectural elements of the wall. And here I brought in an additional drawing just to show you the two conceptions. With that in mind, we can think a little bit about whether portability brings these objects closer to sculpture. I would suggest that transferability works against the idea that this was a sculptural collection in the conventional sense. Of course, much sculpture is portable, and small-scale sculpture, particularly bronzes like the ones we just saw, need not be understood as permanently affixed to any particular site, but rather as movable elements of a collector's holdings. But the idea of porcelain objects being interchangeable according to the desires of a collector, detached from the wall and held in the hand, and at least theoretically, if not actually used, and that's an issue with porcelain in displays like this, is that they were often not used as plates, but the theoretical idea, the sort of possibility that they could be, is there. All of those combine to work against the idea that this was conceived as a sculptural display. It's a slippery point, but the question of porcelain's status clearly concerned Longlun, who in the text just mentioned warned that the object's portability worked against the collection being appreciated as art. The display needed to be handled, he said, with great care, lest it take on, and excuse my French, trop l'air d'un riche magasin, that it would look too much like a richly outfitted store. This comment tries to deflect the criticism that collecting porcelain was a purely commercial endeavor, and its display needed to avoid easy conflation with, to use Barbara Maria Stafford's wonderful phrase, gaping at heaped up goods. Longlun's comment might surprise those of us accustomed to thinking about porcelain's economic importance to Dresden, which is emphasized heavily in the literature. But in it, and the designs for the Japanisches Palais, I think we can locate Longlun's worry that many viewers would not understand porcelain as art. Another place where this tension arises is in the 4 sculptural roundels he proposed to decorate the palace's grand gallery. These were to represent allegorical figures of painting, sculpture, geometry, and chemistry. Porcelain combines all of these, since mastery of each is required in order to produce a porcelain object. Porcelain is therefore a kind of meta-art, one not reducible to sculpture, yet emergent partially from it. With Longlun's display, we can see that porcelain could transcend artistic hierarchies, thereby avoiding easy classification, and that ultimately is the point, to compete with traditional high arts via a new medium. One of the reasons that Longlun's designs de-emphasize porcelain's sculptural potential is that the Japanisches Palais was to contain a space in which porcelain approached sculpture in a purer sense. This was, of course, the celebrated gallery of mice and animals, modeled by Johann Joachim Kendler, and counting among them some of the most famous exemplars of ceramic art. Indeed, they are legendary, notable for their beauty, but more than anything for the technical achievement they represented for the emergent European porcelain industry. These were intended for a special wing of the palace, a separate set of galleries from those we have just discussed. We know very little about how they were arranged, but the sheer number of them, around 80, survive today, and the diversity of their subjects suggests a full, busy installation intended to impress and awe. And there are many of these. They're in museums all over the world, but I brought in one of the local examples. This is the nanny goat with kid at the Metropolitan Museum down the street. The animal's large scale tested the limits of Meyssen's abilities. Records show that Kendler and his assistants struggled to perfect procedures that would allow porcelain to survive firing at this scale and with this level of detail. Viewers have long noted that they push porcelain into the realm of sculpture. They actually are sculpture in the purest classical sense of a three-dimensional figural likeness intended for observation and display. But we should recognize what they meant when placed in galleries in the same building as porcelain plates and vases, like the ones we have just considered. Their inclusion in the Japanisches Palais certainly encourages the collection as a whole to be considered a sculptural one. The Kendler animals were housed on the palace's second floor in rooms only accessible once the visitor had perused a range of cabinets filled with other kinds of objects, ones with formal and functional analogs with more humble kinds of ceramics. After seeing those, one would arrive in the Kendler galleries and see that Meissen had one-upped the visitor's understanding of what porcelain could do by transforming it into pure sculpture. Meissen ingenuity enables porcelain to become sculpture in a conventional sense. This echoes a widespread, long-standing European fantasy, which is that other parts of the world, in this case China, may have created wonderful products through inventive technologies, but only Europe could take that and turn it into art. Furthermore, the Kendler animals invite several different paragone procedures, and I was very happy to hear Dr. Baker refer to the paragone because that's exactly what's happening here, invited as viewers are to compare Meissen objects with other kinds of ceramic art. Between porcelain and marble, which both rely on whiteness, much beloved in 18th century aesthetics, to achieve their effects. And I would further suggest between porcelain and bronze, the closest analog for the objects of this intermediate scale. And in this paragone, porcelain was intended to win, not least because many of the Kendler animals were colored. This simple addition answers a long-standing criticism of sculpture, namely that it could never attain the realism of painting because so often it was monochromatic. It is precisely porcelain's materiality that achieves this complex set of artistic and social resonances. But although the Kendler animals invite the idea that they are a collection of sculptures, indeed it is hard to see them any other way, whether they then confer onto the rest of the collection the status of sculpture, whether they transform the Japanisches Palais in its entirety into a sculptural collection, is less secure. Perhaps they do, or perhaps they simply show that some porcelain could become a collection, but not all porcelain can do that. Their separation from the other galleries in the Palais might only serve to confirm that they are a special kind of object, a sculptural collection made out of a material that is not always sculpture inherently. To conclude, we might ask whether the Japanisches Palais was influential in advancing porcelain's popularity and claim to artistic significance. The obvious answer is yes. It was certainly famous in its own time and served exactly the function that the Saxon-Polish court wanted it to impress visitors and aggrandize through art Dresden's claim to be a first-order player in European cultural politics. Its influence really requires no additional clarification. But whether it served to change notions of what comprised a sculptural collection, and whether porcelain could become the preferred medium for a sculptural collection, there the answer would have to be that it did not. In the wake of Meissen's success, several other 18th century porcelain manufactories took up the possibility that porcelain could be a medium for sculpture. This trend is especially visible in Italy and was carried to its furthest by the manufactory of Carlo Ginori at Doccia, Sesto Fiorentino near Florence, an important early porcelain manufactory with roots in the Dupacchier manufactory in Vienna. Ginori made the sculpturalization of porcelain a major industry project. To show just one example, we see here the famous Medici Venus in its marble incarnation from antiquity, and next to it a 1702 bronze version of the sculpture made, of course, to smaller scale and intended for a different viewing environment. And here we see that Ginori produced a porcelain version of the sculpture in the 1740s. This particular design, interestingly, was reproduced in at least 5 different sizes, intended for different collections, different collectors, and each required porcelain components to be fired and then assembled into the final product, the joins cleverly disguised by the figure's choker, armbands, and loincloth. And this was not a unique piece. Doccia produced other copies of ancient Roman sculptures, including busts of emperors and even celebrated groups like the Laocoon group. The idea here is that small-scale porcelains could be like bronzes, small-scale sculptures, collectible by various segments of the 18th century elite. Yet as the century progressed and porcelain began to be made in larger amounts by manufactories across the continent, as well as the continued importation of porcelain from Asia, the medium began to lose some of its allure. The materiality of porcelain changed even as the medium itself stayed the same. This, I propose, had the effect of confirming porcelain's location in the emergent decorative arts and emphasizing its place within the realm of ceramics and not the high art of sculpture. Porcelain had its sculptural moment in the first half of the 18th century, but the very materiality that gave it that chance also eventually created its exclusion.